Unplugged. I'm Brenna Lenoir, the SVP of Marketing here at CodeSignal, and I'm thrilled to have you join us today as we deep dive on a very pressing topic, AI in hiring. In this episode, we will make sure to dive in on fairness, equity, inclusion, and reducing bias. AI has undoubtedly changed the way that we approach recruiting, providing deeper insights and a more efficient process. But with any innovation comes the responsibility of making sure that we aren't unintentionally reinforcing bias. And today we'll explore this topic with two experts. I'm joined today by Dr. Clementine Collett, who has a PhD from Oxford University in AI and gender bias. Dr. Collett is an expert at the intersection of AI, ethics, and diversity, with her work focusing on the social impacts of AI design and implementation. In November, she'll continue her research at Cambridge University, where she will become a Braid Fellow looking at generative AI systems and their impact on creative industries. Today, I'm also joined by Adam Vassar, the Director of Talent Science at CodeSignal. He holds a master's in industrial organizational psychology and has worked in the talent management industry for 20 years. Adam leads the development of cutting-edge assessment frameworks and the development of learning content. And he's been instrumental in leveraging AI to create fairer and more efficient hiring processes. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Excellent. Let's dive into the questions. So Colette, how has AI transformed technical hiring in recent years, and what shifts do you see in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, sure. So, right, up until the late kind of 1990s, we had analog recruitment. So paper CV taking us way back and cover letter followed by a face-to-face interview. And then things started to transform with the rise of online job boards and then aggregated job boards like Indeed. And then we had social platforms like LinkedIn and Facebook where people could look for jobs. But over the last decade, we've seen AI introduced into the hiring process, and it has just completely boomed. In 2022, the AI recruitment market was valued at $540 million. And COVID-19 also caused this kind of big acceleration in the market because of people being at home and having to hire remotely. So yeah, it's a really big market, and it's completely transformed the way that we recruit. So just thinking about that specifically, it's kind of affected the whole pipeline of recruitment. So firstly, sourcing. This includes systems which kind of scrape data from platforms like LinkedIn or Facebook, and they match or recommend candidates to jobs or jobs to candidates. And this might also take the form of neural network systems which write job descriptions, some of which try to make language as neutral as possible and promote a more diverse applicant pool. Secondly, we have screening systems. It's transformed screening. So this would include systems that screen CVs using machine learning. Thirdly, assessment systems like CodeSignals. This might take the form of games or exercises or tests, which utilize anything really from behavioral science to psychometrics to neuroscientific tests. And this can use, again, machine learning or kind of basic decision trees to compare candidates to desired profiles or clients' top performers, and to recommend the most suitable candidates. And lastly, selection. So this might analyze candidates' criminal history or their social media, for example, using image recognition, just to aid with that final decision. So yeah, its main transformation has been obviously automation and largely the removal of humans from the process of recruiting. And it's kind of affected entirely across that pipeline. Yeah, clients are really motivated to use it because it saves them time and money. But the other transformation that's been a bit blurry that we're talking about a bit today is the impact that they've had on discrimination and bias in hiring.
So with this shift from human-led to AI influence, where do these biases creep in? What are the most common sources?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's actually such a great question that I tried to answer it throughout my my doctoral research. So
So
yeah,
boil down a 100-page research doc took
so I
couple
can
sound
fully
bites
answer
for
this
us.
question. Yeah, that's the catch of that no one tells you about doing a doctorate is that you finish with way more questions than you start with.
Right.
But it was certainly very, very interesting. And yeah, so over 4 years, I worked with 8 international companies, including CodeSignal, to explore how these companies thought about biases in recruitment and how they ventured to translate those definitions into the design. And I think actually the findings give us a really neat way to show how biases manifest and also the sources. So I'll try and run through these 3 ways quickly. But yeah, the first is human perception. So biases were really associated with stereotypes and subjectivity that we carry as humans, along with how we tend to gravitate to people who remind us of ourselves. And AI systems were kind of seen to be able to not hold those assumptions about people in the same way. But of course, this is not always guaranteed. It depends on how the system is trained and how it's used. So, for example, a lot of these systems are used in a hybrid way with humans and technology. So it depends on whether the employers are using them as a prompt or kind of using them more entirely. The second way is structural injustices. So this is structural injustices caused by differences in education and class. And one ways that companies would tackle this, like CodeSignal, is by focusing on skills instead of using university and qualifications as a proxy for skill. And this means that hopefully what you do is you maximize for validity, e.g., whether someone can actually do the job, and diversity. But again, of course, there's a catch here. This doesn't necessarily always happen because you might have people who haven't managed to escape those structural injustices, but it does hopefully catch those outliers of people who have managed to do that against the odds. And the third way is statistical. This is a really interesting way, in my opinion. There's probably quite a lot to unpack here, but just to summarize it, yeah, I think obviously quantifying bias is also important, and a lot of companies talked about this. Yeah, mapping it onto actual demographic diversity of hires. So this was usually based, I found, on the fourth fifth rule, which is outlined in the Uniform Guidelines of 1978, itself based on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And this is a ratio of the proportion of successful pass rates of the highest passing demographic group with another demographic groups, meaning that the ratio should not be less than 0.8 of the successful candidates. And this is just one way that the government look at employment discrimination. And it's so important for us, of course, to think about statistically how this is impacting the makeup of our workforces. But again, it kind of reflects how this bias is not just about process, but it's about outcome. And yeah, I found that this was kind of done through internal impact assessments, often on accumulated client data, not often on specific client data. And I didn't speak to clients. My research was just on vendors. But of course, in the law, it is the responsibility of the employer, not the vendor, to ensure that there's no discrimination. But there were cases where some companies would say they were EEOC compliant, when obviously this isn't possible for starters. And it's also alluding to a kind of accumulated client data, not looking at specific instances. So I'd say this is such an important way of us to think about bias manifestations, but I think it needs more work.
I have some follow-up questions for you, but Adam, I know that you've worked with many, many, many clients here and at other organizations. Can you talk about your thoughts on what can organizations do to ensure that AI supports diversity and inclusivity without compromising on the efficiency that it delivers?
Absolutely. I think in the early days of AI, it was kind of unbridled in its usage. The automation was turned loose, and the decision criteria and the guardrails really weren't there. I recall I was at a conference in Atlanta where it was interesting. It was the earlier days of machine learning. You had a lot of data scientists on one side of the room, and then the IO psychologists like myself on the other side of the room. And it was a little early days, standoffish, turf war, perspectives. And since then, it's become much more collaborative, I think. But The initial presentations were, well, the candidates that have a Gmail email address, they tend to be most successful. So we're keying in on those semantics in their resume. And I thought to myself, I am quite certain that has an age bias to it, and also is completely not job related in any way, shape, or form. So this concept of just identifying those things that happen to correlate, maybe without causation, with job performance, or who are deemed or perceived as successful candidates, it was coming to the forefront of how these analyses were being automatically done. And that was problematic, and certainly didn't have the more classical focus that Clementine shared around job relatedness, EEOC compliance, and monitoring for diversity, or 4/5 rule. And I think early use of AI because of that got a bit of a bad reputation. And I think a big part for me, where I want people to embrace it, not be afraid of it, is the opportunity to overcome some of the things that Clementine even called out. Whereas we've increased how wide we can cast the net, we can identify more candidates, non-traditional learning backgrounds, better representation of underrepresented groups. But thus far, all we've done is be able to evaluate who actually has the skill. And we're doing so better. We're not just looking at universities or resumes. We're giving them a chance through AI and through technology to show they had the skill and actually do a simulated version of the job. So that's huge. That's a huge benefit to overcome some of the diversity challenges. Now, what we haven't done yet, though, is the structural injustice component that Clementine mentioned. And that's the part that I'm so excited about, which is to say, okay, we can evaluate whether you have it right now or not, but do you not have it now because of past socioeconomic, racial injustice, and other challenges? You just didn't have an opportunity to acquire the skill. Can we use AI to provide democratized, cheap access to acquire the skill and then evaluate the skill? And Brenda, you mentioned efficiency. Can we recycle candidate pools? Candidates who are rejected, can they be given access to these cheaper, free, more automated, scalable learning solutions through AI, and then be re-recruited? That's efficiency, that's cost saving for organizations in terms of identifying candidates, and it gives them a chance to acquire the skill, not just be evaluated if they have it or not. So to me, that's one of the most exciting parts of this.
Great. You both touched on this a little bit, but I want to ask more directly. Can AI actually help reduce bias in hiring? And Colette, I'll ask you first, and then Adam, I'd love your answer as well.
Sure, I'll give a quick answer. Yeah, I think disclaimer on my part, I think that there's never going to be no bias in hiring practices. And I know that's something that's often said, but I think that is true and it's really important to recognize, but we can try and reduce it, definitely. The other thing to say is that I think while these systems can help to reduce bias in some of the ways I was talking about before, if we think about biases in those three ways, that's not always guaranteed because it depends so much on the way that the system is designed and the way that it's used, and those two things together. So I think that there's a long way to go. It's not impossible, obviously, that these systems will help us to reduce bias, but it is so dependent on context, how they're being trained and how they relate to these social realities.
And Adam, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I've spent a number of years designing behavioral interview guides and programs, training on best practices for human interviewers, and building role play simulations that then humans had to act out in front of a candidate and then, properly evaluate with notes after the fact.
That's hard to do.
Well, it took 6 months to do, any kind of program. And I was so proud of the content and the spirit and the context, as Clementine said, but always a little disappointed and concerned about the variance in interviewer skill and capability. So, people are often fearful of AI bias, but human bias exists in thousands of interviews that will be conducted in the next few hours across the world. Not through any maliciousness, just through inconsistent asking of different questions or inconsistent evaluation of answers, or the similar to me, different from me human biases that Clementine referenced. So to me, AI offers an opportunity to take those tried and true, ask this question, evaluate it this way, don't worry about this part, don't ask this question, and to really control a lot of that and use that traditional proven methodology of validity and reliability and train AI with that, as opposed to, as I said before, allowing AI to kind of conjure up decision rules and things that just aren't fair or don't make sense for job relatedness. So I see it as an opportunity to use what we've come up with in the past, but not count on interviewers to be good role play actors or to fight against their own human biases.
Humans really struggle to be consistent. Based on what you just talked about in your experience, what are the practical steps that talent acquisitions teams can take to make sure their recruiting systems are fair?
So I think it, piggybacking off a few things we've mentioned, I think it starts with consistency, which can be hard. The more humans we have involved, sometimes because we feel like only those humans have the expertise. We talked about technical hiring processes a lot, when a lot of times I feel like TA teams are like, well, you're the software engineer, just meet with them and have them code something. I have no idea what it takes to do this job. Yeah. And again, very talented software engineers putting forward good exercises, but different exercises depending on the hiring manager. So candidates are not even getting the same opportunity to showcase their skills, which is the core attribute of fairness. Consistent, similar opportunities to showcase what you can do. The other big piece of it is job relatedness. And as a psychologist, I always ring this bell, and sometimes people get tired of hearing it, but that was where I was initially a little bit disappointed in the early AI legislation. It's because it was really Clementine, you mentioned 1978, the EEOC guidelines and the uniform guidelines. It was referencing the adverse impact concerns of that legislation, but not the requirements of job relatedness. So they're putting on a lot of organizations to share their adverse impact potential ratios, which is fantastic because it's going to enforce doing the right thing, but it's not doubling down on the need for these things to be related to what it takes to do the job well in the real world, in real life, once you're hired. So job relatedness is key. And then the 4/5 rule is the go-to. And Clementine did a very nice job of summarizing that, just a way to statistically evaluate whether or not you're unintentionally creating disparate impact for underrepresented groups through your hiring practices and taking corrective action if you find that.
Great. And Clementine, as AI continues to evolve, if we think long-term, looking forward, what are the ways or strategies that organizations can adopt to prevent future bias from creeping in?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that I think practically can happen, but just to flag before that, I think a useful way of thinking about biases in general, as outlined above, is socio-technically. So trying to capture both practice that involves evaluating the social aspects of these systems and the technical ones. So yeah, I think kind of looking at the social assumptions underlying the tests, talking to design teams, to vendor companies about how the tool interacts with society, how skills and behaviors have been shaped, and the underlying kind of tests that these are based on. And then also the technical things, the input, the output. And as Adam was just talking about, I think that the 4/5 rule, in my opinion, is relatively outdated and also carries these exceptions within the guidelines about business necessity and small numbers that can carry lots of ways for companies to kind of get around the 4/5 rule. So we can maybe come onto this later, but I think there's definitely room for those kinds of more stringent guidelines to be put in place around what way we should be thinking about quantifying bias in a way that's helpful for everybody. But yeah, two really practical steps I have to offer. I think one is more collaboration between vendors, clients, and then also with academics and independent bodies. I think so far that in my experience, academics and independent bodies have been slightly more siloed from the conversation. And I think that actually we could all work together in order to build a more positive reality in terms of bias. So yeah, I think as a gold standard that testing on data of successful candidates could happen together, could be performed by academic institutions or independent bodies through an open science framework, which would allow companies to share their data in a protected way And then the second way that I would suggest is socio-technical audits alongside statistical impact assessments, so that we're capturing those social aspects as well as the technical ones when we're testing for biases in these systems. And yeah, I think there's, again, room to develop a socio-technical audit for these systems, but one that has been produced that is really helpful is by Mona Sloan et al. 2022 paper called a Silicon Valley Love Triangle, where they outline a socio-technical approach to auditing the systems, which I think is a really useful resource.
Who's in this Silicon Valley Love Triangle?
That is a good question. It's Mona Sloan, and then I think it's Ruman Chowdhury. And
that's all. I didn't mean to put you on the spot with
no,
that.
no, it's fine. I'm just looking it up. And Emmanuel Moss. Yeah.
Got it. I got it. All right. Thank
And
you.
just
it's a great paper, though. I do recommend it to anyone who's interested.
And I couldn't concur more, by the way, in terms of, I recall I was going through graduate school, like end of 90s, early 2000s, so a while back, but learning about 1964, 1967, 1978, in my mind, I'm like, oh, I can't wait for what's coming next. And really, nothing has happened significantly since then, other than some of the AI legislation, but still doesn't do enough. Evaluation of discrimination and requirements around fairness and validity requires, we need a major update and a big catch up, no doubt.
Yeah. And I think actually that was something that surprised me about my research as well, was that almost all of the vendor companies who I worked with and researched were very open to more regulation, which was something I wasn't necessarily expecting to find, because you often think about innovation and regulation at odds, but actually it's really useful and it can really help if it's framed well.
The legislation often drives the need for rigor that we recommend anyway. So it's a nice cyclical relationship that tends to benefit just doing things well and doing things right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we want more regulation that's helpful and productive. I think we're going to see more innovation on the AI side. So question for you, Adam, what AI innovation do you think is going to have the most significant impact on the hiring process in years to come?
So I like to think of job performance and human potential as like a pie, right? Different slices of pie. And as Clementine mentioned, late 90s, early 2000s, we began to be able to administer online assessments and better tap into evaluation of candidates' potential without them having to come on site, which was a huge evolution and step forward. But it tends to only happen for one slice of the pie, right? Let's say even within coding simulations, we're really tapping into hard skills and using that to identify who should pass forward in a recruiting funnel, which would then involve a lot of soft skills slices of a pie, communication capability, collaboration experiences done through some sort of behavioral interview, culture fit, alignment of someone's values with the mission of the organization, which again happens through a human-led interview. So just to put the nerdy statistics hat on, I'm excited about AI's capability to more broadly and in an automated remote fashion, do more early measurements of all of those slices. Do I fit with your culture? Do I work well in a team? And do I have the required hard skills to be successful in the role? We're always going to have human-led conversations, but those are always going to be held tightly for the top candidates, given the time and expense involved. So if we could better identify people into those human-led interactions based on measuring more of their capability, I think it's going to solve some of our diversity challenges. I think it's just also going to bring in better people deeper into the process and make better hires, which is good for the person you hire and is great for the company. So we'd love to get more slices of the pie through those AI type of interactions.
That same question. Interested in what innovation you think is coming and how it's going to impact hiring.
Yeah, sure. I think this is a really interesting question, and I think it's so interesting because there are so many unforeseen ways that I think it will impact hiring, but just I guess a couple in my mind. Of course, the first thing that comes to my mind is how generative AI will change the way that skills are developing and being learned. And the use of these systems will kind of change how people acquire skills and complete these tests, and also just the job market in general. So, you know, what skills are needed, what jobs require. So, yeah, it might change how these systems are designed. And then I guess in kind of the short term as well, I think another kind of change within AI systems that will change the landscape of how AI recruitment tech is used is agentic AI. I think that would be an interesting development to see how it changes these systems and workplaces in general. So obviously, this is the ability of systems to act proactively rather than reactively, and to kind of use that independent or autonomous ability to act. So yeah, I think that will be interesting to see how that shapes workforces, or even the way that AI systems are designed and how they function. And I think that could take a slightly unanticipated form. But yeah, I also hope, I guess my hope is good to put in there as well. I hope we will see changes in the design and use of these systems to be more inclusive, to really think more about these issues, because they are so important, and of course they impact people's lives and livelihoods. So yeah, that's my big hope for the future.
And on that same note, you know, we talked about with any innovation, there's also the responsibility to make sure that we're not taking steps back in other ways. So how can companies prepare for the ethical challenges that are going to arise in this AI future?
Yeah, absolutely. Because of course, bias is just one of the ethical challenges that arise for these technologies. We've also got to think about transparency between vendors and clients, and also between employers and their applicants. And we've got to think about privacy, so ensuring that all candidate data is kept really safe and secure, and ensuring, you know, cybersecurity is really high up on the agenda for employers as well, and vendors, of course. And yeah, I would say in this scenario, kind of top down is very much true in these scenarios, where it's important to ensure that leadership teams really care about these issues. But also, I would say that bottom up is true, and that if you are an employee at a company who obviously are using these systems or hiring, if you're aware of these issues and you kind of discuss them with your leadership teams, ensure that companies are working responsibly and it has a good culture of challenge and collaboration, then I think that's really positive. And yeah, I think the ethics to practice is so hard. This is something we actually wrote a paper on. I wrote with my supervisor and a colleague from PwC a few years ago on what we called the implementation gaps, which is literally translating these broad ethical principles when we say things like transparency into practice. And we found that so many companies found this really difficult because it's not concrete, which is probably going back to what we were saying earlier, Adam, is why regulation is kind of craved, because it gives you something to concrete to cling on to. But this is why collaboration is so important, in my opinion, bringing in voices from different stakeholders, academics, regulators, independent bodies, the candidates themselves, I think can really help to overcome some of those gaps.
Great. Thank you so much. So I have a question for you both, which is, do you have any final thoughts or advice that you'd like to share? And Adam, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think we're really at an inflection point for candidate hiring that we haven't seen since, as was mentioned at the top of the conversation, early 2000s, where all of a sudden, rather than having to fly a candidate to your brick and mortar testing location and pay a proctor to give them a paper pencil test and train a proctor to appropriately key and score the results, right? Now you can take it from home in your pajamas, right? And even then, though, I recall it was a big deal. Like, are people cheating, and are they compromising the test content? And there was a lot of fear of the change. But obviously, when done correctly, it increased the ability and validity to identify high potential candidates and give the right people the right jobs, and also the ability to be consistent and fair, right? If we're ensuring there are not systematic group differences in scoring, and we're being consistent and giving people opportunities to showcase their talents. So when done correctly, I think both on the fairness and diversity side and predictive validity side, it was a big win. we're at a similar inflection point with AI. And I think there is fear, and some of the fear is well founded around the ethical concerns and proper use, and ensuring that it further enhances fairness and in a valid way predicting who would be the best candidate, and doesn't perpetuate biases by being used incorrectly or used in this kind of unbridled manner. But just like back then, I think the train has left the station, and we just need to lean into mitigating risks, and capitalizing on the benefits. But yeah, I think the open sharing of data, whether it's vendors or customer organizations or academia, I think that's going to be key, so we can see what's working and make it work better.
Yeah, absolutely. And Colette, what about you?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that last point. I think collaboration to me is really key going forward. And I think Adam's right. Obviously, this changes is happening. It's inevitable. It's just only going to become more kind of prominent and prolific as time goes by. So yeah, I think my main thought is there's a lot of work to be done. There's more research needed. We need more openness and transparency from both vendor companies like CodeSignal so wonderfully is, and employers as well, to kind of deeply and wholly consider the benefits and the risks, because these systems affect people every day. And yeah, I think as well, kind of thinking more about the solid things that we have to cling on to. That's another main message for me from our conversation, is urging companies to also get involved in that regulatory sphere, to think about, we need things like clarification of state-specific laws, and we need to rethink the statistical measurements that are being used pre and post implementation. In my opinion, we need to move forward the Algorithmic Accountability Act in the US. But yeah, I think that I would encourage companies not to shy away from that space, and to collaborate with regulatory bodies on this, so that it can be something which is also, that they can use and do. And I think ultimately that will help these companies, because the more that they prioritize issues like ethics and ethical issues, like bias, the more diverse their workforces will be, and the better that is ultimately for their productivity. I mean, that's just been shown time and time again, and their culture. So yeah, I think that they can help themselves and society at the same time.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your insights and your experience with us today. If anyone listening wants to learn more, there's a couple resources that we've attached to this webinar, including a really great playbook that helps you introduce more consistency to your hiring process, which also helps you optimize it as well. And if you don't grab those, don't worry, we'll follow up with you as well. Thanks again for giving us a listen today. We look forward to sharing next time on Hiring Leaders Unplugged. Have a great day.